Hi, everybody. Chad here. I've recently started a Patreon account. So if this podcast resonates with you and you'd like to help me wake up the world one podcast at a time, then you can find me on Patreon. Sign up and you get 10% off merch. Coming soon. Wilbert Smith may be the most important guy you've never heard of. He was a radio engineer for the government of Canada, and he helped start Project Magnet, Canada's flying saucer investigation program. And he was also in contact with interdimensional beings.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is.
And we're containers that's how supposedly the aliens look at us.
It would be a shift in the knowledge of humanity, a new knowledge.
What the hell is going on?
In most Western countries, information is classified to protect national security. And there are levels of classification. Confidential could cause damage if disclosed. Secret could cause serious damage if disclosed. And top secret could cause exceptionally grave damage if disclosed. So when someone has a top secret clearance, it means they've passed through all kinds of background checks and investigations in order to be eligible. But just because you've passed through all the checks and balances, just because you are now eligible and have this top secret clearance, doesn't mean you can see every top secret document. That's when another form of secrecy comes in, and it's called need to know. So basically, you are only allowed to have access to top secret information that you absolutely must know in order to do your job. So even a 4-star general may not be read into top secret programs unless it's relevant to their command. If you think about it, military leadership rotates every few years anyways. So why tell them any more than they need to know? And contractors who work for the Department of Defense companies, they often stay in these programs for decades. So let's say a civilian engineer at Lockheed Skunk Works or Raytheon would have more access to top secret information and understanding of exactly what reality is because they need to know it in order to do their job, even though they have no official rank. So when you think about it that way, it's not the government that holds all the secrets to reality and that's holding out on humanity what the truth is. It's actually corporations. And probably Department of Defense corporations. So if you want to know what's going on, don't look to the spokesman for the Department of Defense corporations, the president. You want to look to the engineers, the scientists, the open-minded academics, because over the past 50, 60, 70 years, there's a lot of them that have spoke out and said some wild things. I really do think that the whole top secret classification thing is just a smokescreen, and it's a distraction that causes us to look to the wrong people for the truth about reality. So today, in our search for truth, we're going to look at an electrical engineer who lived in the 1950s. But in order to really understand this, we first have to step into the shoes of where society was at in the 1950s. The Second World War had really just ended, and humanity had officially entered the atomic age. I mean, the atom bomb changed everything. The world had seen science unleash this godlike power, and everyone was terrified, but also in awe of it, of how powerful nuclear energy was, and how it could be harnessed for good instead of evil. Nuclear weapons could be used to destroy the planet, but you could also use it for really cheap power. And everything was so new, and there was so many new inventions that there was a deep faith in progress. With the invention of television, computers, jet travel, and rockets, humanity had really stepped up a rung on the evolutionary ladder, if you think about it that way, especially compared to just 50 years earlier. It felt like human ingenuity had no limits. Magazines like Popular Science and Popular Mechanics talked about things like flying cars, owning your own robot, and putting colonies on Mars. And they also talked about something else that was new in the 1950s. These things called flying saucers.
In France, like America, the flying saucer mystery makes headlines. A young Frenchman photographed this flying saucer, or is it, from a mountainside in central France. Military officials, suspecting that the object was a meteorological balloon, send one aloft and photograph it. But comparison shows a striking contrast, and puzzled officials wonder, what was it? In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen at the CAA Traffic Control Center at National Airport for several hours, traveling more than 100 miles an hour. Air Force jet fighters spend several hours chasing the objects plotted on the radar scope. General Sanford, Air Force Intelligence Director, confirms that the objects are not secret American weapons and reiterates the Air Force's obligation to investigate.
Sightings exploded of them in the 50s. And in the beginning, they were seen as a legitimate mystery. There was no cultural taboo attached to them like we have right now. And then when the Air Force started these special programs looking into these things, Project Sun and Project Grudge, they gave a sense of credibility to the whole thing. And some describe it that there was a hopeful sense of curiosity that Earth was being visited by something advanced. Newspapers, radio shows, and even some scientists treated the question seriously. And one of those scientists who was super interested in this new flying saucer phenomena was a guy in Ottawa, Canada, named Wilbert Smith. He was an electrical engineer, and he worked for the Canadian government in the Department of Transport. He was in the Radio Regulations Engineering Division. And in the late 1940s, he was captivated by all the magazine articles on UFOs. So he eventually read a book by Frank Scully called Behind the Flying Saucers. And this was a book that claimed that the U.S. government had recovered crashed UFOs and alien bodies. But Wilbert, being an engineer, was fascinated around the technological implications of these UFOs. The idea that these UFOs might operate using principles like magnetic or gravitational fields. Those ideas lined up with his own theories about geomagnetism. Because that's what his job was. He worked in geomagnetism and atmospheric physics. So you can see how the idea of this new type of propulsion would be fascinating. And when you think of the quick progress they had just made, going from the steam engine into the 1800s, to the combustible engine in the early 1900s, then to using propellers for airplanes, and then on to jet engines in the mid to late 40s. Back then, it would seem only natural that they will find another form of propulsion in the near future. And it kind of makes you wonder, with all of those UFO sightings suddenly popping up, maybe they did find a new form of propulsion. And that's what Wilbert wanted to find out. And in 1950, Wilbert got to go to Washington, D.C. as a part of a Canadian delegation to attend a North American radio conference, which apparently was a real snoozer. So, in his boredom, he thought he'd ask around about the new flying saucer phenomenon and what people thought about it. And he said he stirred up a real hornet's nest. And he thought, where there's smoke, there's fire. So he asked a colleague from the Canadian Embassy to inquire with Dr. Robert Sarbacher about the reality of these flying saucers. Sarbacher was one of the top U.S. government military scientists. He had worked in areas like missile guidance systems and nuclear physics. And he's even credited with inventing the proximity fuse for the Manhattan Project. So if there's anyone who may have an idea of what's going on with this flying saucer stuff, it was probably him. So through the embassy, he was able to have a meeting with Sarbacher. And some years after Wilbert's death, they found a transcript of this very meeting in his own files, written in his own handwriting. And in this meeting, Smith directly asked Sarbacher about the claims in Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers. He said, "I would like to know how much about this book is true." And remember, this book claimed that the U.S. government had recovered crashed UFOs and alien bodies. And Sarbacher's answer was, yes. The facts reported in the book are substantially correct. And Wilbert says, so the saucers exist? And Sarbacher's answer was, yes, they exist. And Wilbert goes on to ask, so they operate the way that Frank Scully suggests on magnetic principles? And he's then told that they have not been able to duplicate their performance. And his next question is, so do they come from another planet? And he's told, all we know is that we didn't make them, and it's pretty certain they didn't originate on Earth. And he then goes on to tell him that this is so top secret, it's classified 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb, and that it was the most top secret subject in the entire U.S. government at that time. And Smith asks, well, can I ask the reason for this top secret classification? And he's told, you can ask, but I can't tell you. And he then goes on to explain to him that if he goes through the correct channels, he will fill him in on what they know. So he came back to Canada and got to work. And on November 21st of 1950, he sent a top secret memo to the Department of Transport. And in that memo, he talks about how for the past number of years, they've been studying various aspects of radio wave propagation, which led them into atmospheric radioactivity and geomagnetism. And he goes on to say, and I quote, "We are on the track of a means whereby the potential energy of the Earth's magnetic field may be abstracted and used." Well, that sounds to me like anti-gravity technology. He then says that they've done experiments in his laboratory that look promising, and that he has a design that's completed for a unit which should be self-sustaining and, in addition, provide a small surplus of power. And he believes that they are on the track of something which will prove to be the introduction of a new technology. He then talks about his trip to Washington, D.C. for the NARB conference, and how while he was there were 2 books that had been released. One, Behind the Flying Saucer by Frank Scully, and another one, The Flying Saucers Are Real by Donald Kehoe. He then explains that most books deal mostly with sightings of unidentified objects, and that both books also claim that flying objects were of extraterrestrial origin and may well be spaceships from another planet. He then talks about how Frank Scully, the author of Behind the Flying Saucer, thinks that these flying saucers operated on some type of unknown magnetic principle. And Wilbert says that it appears to him that their own work in geomagnetics may well be the linkage between their technology and the technology by which the saucers are designed and operated. And he goes on to explain that their geomagnetic investigations may be going in the right direction. And if that's true, then the theory of operating these saucers becomes quite straightforward. So remember, Wilbert is an engineer, and he's working in and doing experiments with geomagnetism. And he's saying, I think I know how these things work. That it's entirely possible for these flying saucers to operate in the way that they do. Now back to the memo. He says that when he was in Washington, he made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy staff, and that they were able to obtain the following information. The flying saucer phenomena is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the hydrogen bomb. That flying saucers actually exist. Their mode of operating is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, and that this entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. Now you may be wondering, who's Vannevar Bush? Well, back then in the science community, he was kind of a big deal. He was famous for leading U.S. World War II science efforts, Manhattan Project, and radar technology. In 1945, he wrote a book called The Endless Frontier, which created the National Science Foundation. And wouldn't you know it, he's also a co-founder of the Department of Defense company, Raytheon. That's interesting. Now, Raytheon is a company that has been rumored since at least the 1940s to have recovered off-world non-human technology. And the rumors are that they have reverse-engineered propulsion systems, and that they have new types of energy and power systems. And it's also been rumored that Raytheon has an advanced materials division, that they've taken materials from UFO crashes and have the ability to replicate them, and that these materials even have morphing capabilities. Guys like Jacques Vallée and Hal Puthoff have publicly disclosed that they have actually seen and analyzed these types of materials. And it's also been rumored that they have advanced sensors and UFO jammers. Now, these jammers are said to detect, track, and potentially even jam or interfere with UFOs. And when the Air Force whistleblower David Grush, under oath in a congressional hearing, stated that the U.S. government possesses systems that can jam UFOs. Now, he didn't say that it was Raytheon, but he did say that defense contractors were involved and possess this capability. So I find it very interesting that Vannevar Bush, one of the co-founders of Raytheon, is in an internal top-secret Canadian government memo, and he is described as heading up this flying saucer investigation program for the U.S. government. Like, seriously, how much more evidence do we need before we realize that those sons of bitches are hiding technology breakthroughs from humanity? All right, let's get back to the memo. Now, this is my favorite part. He says, I was further informed that the United States authorities are investigating along quite a number of lines, which might possibly be related to the saucers, such as mental phenomena, and I gather that they are not doing too well, since they indicated that if Canada is doing anything at all in geomagnetics, that they would welcome a discussion with suitably accredited Canadians. So in other words, if any of your scientists up there have any idea of what may be going on, let us know. Now let's just think about what he's been saying in this memo so far. He has confirmation from high-up scientists in the US government that this whole flying saucer phenomena is super secretive, that flying saucers actually do exist. They're not quite sure how they work, but they have a group headed up by one of the top scientists, Vannevar Bush, and they're looking into these flying saucers somehow are connected to mental phenomena, consciousness. Now remember, this is in November of 1950, and this is a top secret internal government memo that was not declassified and made public until the 1980s. And we're talking about guys from Vannevar Bush to Robert Sarbacher and Wilbert Smith. These were some of the top guys in their fields, and they were pursuing something that we would call in this day and age pseudoscience. And remember, it's not the politicians or the high-ranking military generals' jobs to know what's going on. It's the scientists. And these are first-hand accounts of what these scientists were talking about. They actually had a need to know. Now, Wilbert ends the memo by saying that he has been in contact with Dr. Soledant. He was the chairman of the Canadian Defence Research Board, so he would have been one of the most powerful scientists in Canada. He brought up this matter with him, and he agreed that the work on geomagnetic energy should go forward as rapidly as possible. And he offered providing laboratory facilities, acquisition of necessary items of equipment, and specialized personnel for working on the project. So he's basically asking the Department of Transport for funding to start up a project looking into flying saucers and how they work. And they actually said yes. And in December 1950, Project Magnet started. And this project was set up with the Department of Transport's Radio Regulations Engineering Division, which means it was housed under an existing scientific department, not the military. Because if the military did get a hold of this, you can imagine what would happen. They would try to weaponize it, and they would see UFOs as a threat and a matter of defense, instead of pursuing scientifical breakthrough and possibly new laws of physics. So in December of 1950, Wilbert and his team got to work. They had a practical goal of building unique equipment that could detect electromagnetic or gravitational disturbances that a flying saucer might make. The equipment that they had was radio receivers to monitor any radio signals. They had gravimeters. Those are instruments that measure changes in the gravitational field. And they also had gamma ray detectors because they thought that an electromagnetic propulsion system might produce ionizing radiation as its type of exhaust. But their most important instrument was a magnetometer. A magnetometer measures the strength and direction of the magnetic field. The military used these for submarine detection, geophysical surveys, mine detection, nuclear test monitoring, and research and development. And they used a special type of cobalt bismuth wire, which was exceptionally sensitive to rapid, small-scale fluctuations in the magnetic field. And there's a story where Wilbert is complaining that little wire was damaged or broken. And he was saying it's those damn Russians testing their atomic weapons. They broke the wire in the magnetometer. Which, if that's true, it shows you how destructive nuclear weapons are to this dimension. And so they felt that this magnetometer was their best chance at detecting a flying saucer if it was nearby. And they fit all these instruments into a little shack that he had at a government facility in a place called Shirley's Bay, just outside of Ottawa, Ontario. They had this little shack all wired up to continuously monitor and record their readings on multiple chart recorders. And that is what they called their flying saucer observatory. And that wasn't the only way they were looking for flying saucers, because Smith's Department of Transport Radio Regulations Engineering was already working with Lockheed of California on radio propagation and ionospheric research. Lockheed had advanced instrumentation for magnetic field mapping and gravitational variations. So, under Project Magnet, he arranged for data sharing and experimental flights using this Lockheed Constellation aircraft equipped with all these magnometers and gravity meters, and they were usually flying in Canada's far north and along specific magnetic field lines. And they were looking for small magnetic disturbances or gravity anomalies that coincide with UFO reports. His hypothesis was that flying saucers may interact with the Earth's magnetic field in order to achieve propulsion. And he felt that maybe the sensitive instrumentation on these planes would pick up local geomagnetic or gravitational line distortions. So basically, he was hoping to see measurable magnetic or gravitational ripples in the areas where flying saucers had been reported. Now, at the same time down in the US, they had their own version of Project Magnet too, and it was called Project Magnet. Now, some think that these projects were related. I mean, for crying out loud, they started around the same time, they had the same name, and they were both flying planes all over the Earth measuring the strength of the magnetic field. And it's also thought that the project was started because Vannevar Bush had gotten wind of some of Wilbert Smith's ideas. Now the question is, did they ever find something? Well, I guess there was some recorded brief blips or anomalies that we know of, but nothing conclusive. So up in Canada, they didn't find anything with the planes. But his flying saucer observatory did. On August 8th, 1954, at about 3:01 p.m., the instrumentation at the Shirley's Bay Observatory registered an unusual disturbance. It was said that the gravimeter went wild, and everybody inside ran outside to have a look. But the skies were heavily overcast with poor visibility, so they couldn't visually confirm anything. The only evidence that they had was in the instrumentational data. But that was enough to create some excitement, and the local press picked it up and ran some stories. And then, 2 days later, Project Magnet was shut down. And guaranteed, it was shut down because they actually found something. And then all their data and all their discoveries goes underground and instantly becomes top secret. Project Magnet was sharing stuff with the US government. So of course, when Wilbert actually got something to work and detected a flying saucer, they had Canada shut it down and they implemented his invention. And just think, that may be what David Grush was referring to before the Congress. That they possess sensitive equipment that can sense UFOs. And that right there would fit with the theme of Wilbert Smith's life. His wife said that he had 37 patents, and 36 of them were stolen by the government. And maybe this right here is just another invention that the government stole from him. Now, Wilbert was allowed to carry on his work at the Shirley's Bay facility, but the government stopped all funding for his research, and he had to do it after hours and in his spare time, which he did. And in 1959, Smith stated that he had conducted experiments that show it is possible to create artificial gravity and to alter the gravitational field of the Earth, and that he has done it. That it is a fact, and that the next step is to learn the rules and to do the engineering necessary to convert the principle into workable hardware. But according to his wife, when he told his government superiors about what he had come up with and that he wanted to show it to them, they told him to just write it down. Basically, just draw up the plans, Wilbert. Because if he draws up the plans, then they can steal it, like the other 36 of his ideas they stole. So, as his wife puts it, he came home and he said, maybe the world isn't ready. And he never spoke about it for the rest of his life. And sometime after this happened, he died of cancer at the age of 52, December 27th, 1962. And when he died, his life's work died along with him. His work on flying saucers and anti-gravity devices, they all came to a halt, and the research at the Shirley's Bay facility was closed. Of course, there's a lot of conspiracy stories around Wilbur's death. From what I understand, it looked like it was a type of colon cancer, but it just seems to me, anyone that looks into alternate forms of energy seem to have untimely and early deaths. It's definitely a pattern, especially when the work dies with you, that there is no one that picks it up or carries it on. And before he died, he told his wife that after he's gone, she has to hide his files and all of his papers. He told her, they will come for these, and you can't give them to him. So, she gave them to her son, who then gave them to a trusted friend. And sure enough, very soon after his death, the Canadian, the American, and the Russian governments were at her doorstep asking for his files and his papers. Of course, she said she didn't have any. And after that, there were a few break-ins, but I'm sure that was purely coincidental. Of course, I'm kidding. This guy was on the same level as Tesla. All right, now, that concludes our nuts and bolts side of the story. That is the side of the story that you will get in a Google or YouTube search. Very interesting, but nothing too out there. But there is another side of this story that gets very strange. There is a Canadian UFO researcher named Grant Cameron. If you've listened to the Chris Bledsoe story, he's actually in it. He was at Chris's house when some stuff went down with the orbs, and his dog was injured and almost died, and then he healed it, and Grant was there. So in my books, that makes him pretty legit. And in the mid-1970s, in Manitoba, where Grant lives, there was, as he puts it, a UFO flap. This was part of a massive wave of UFO sightings across Canada. And in Manitoba, where he lived, they were going out in the evenings and watching them. He was even taking people there. And his first-hand experience showed him that UFOs are real, and he began to investigate. And as luck would have it, Grant's father was a pilot for the Canadian Department of Transport. And he was well-liked, had a good reputation, and everybody knew him. So because of Grant's father's connection, he began to ask questions around the Department of Transport, and people were willing to talk. And one day an old radar tech told him, well, if you're interested in UFOs, you should look into this guy named Wilbert Smith. So, a long story short, Grant looks into Wilbert Smith, contacts people from his inner circle that used to work for him, and he even ends up flying to Ottawa, Ontario to meet Wilbert's wife and his son. And as he tells it, he went to Ontario for the first time, drove to Wilbert's wife's house, picked her up, and was taking her to Wilbert's son's house so that he could interview them. And as he's driving in the car, Wilbert's wife is talking about somebody named Afa, almost like he was the family pet. And it turns out, Afa was the alien that Wilbert had contact with. That's right. Wilbert was in contact with an alien. In fact, he had a notepad beside his bed, and he would write stuff down in his sleep, ideas that he would get or things that he was told. In fact, many of the ideas that he had and inventions came from things he heard in his sleep. And he wasn't shy about it at all. His co-workers all knew about it. And in fact, one of his co-workers told Grant, he was always talking about Afa. Afa this, Afa that. So I told him, Wilbert, Afa pint of beer, why don't you? And Wilbert didn't hide the fact that some of the ideas that he got were in his sleep from this alien Afa. And sometimes they would have a hard time getting some of his ideas to work. And he would tell his guys, come on, they're not going to come down here and give it to us. We got to do our homework too. Which I think that idea is just a really interesting perspective. Kind of reminds me of Star Trek's Prime Directive. That there are certain laws of the universe that cannot be violated. And that there are some things that we just have to figure out for ourselves. But they can show us where to look. Now, in order to understand how Wilbert came into contact with this alien, we have to go to Eliot, Maine. In 1954, there was a retired Navy admiral, Herbert Knowles. He was an officer on a submarine. So his background was in communications and radar during World War II. And when he retired, he became involved in metaphysical and spiritual groups. I guess he was an open-minded guy. And in one of these groups, he met a woman named Mrs. Frances Swan, who happened to live in the same neighborhood that he did. And she confided in him that she had recently begun automatic writing sessions in which she claimed to receive telepathic communications from beings aboard a spacecraft. And the main communicator's name was Afa, and he was some type of commander. So he was skeptical at first, but eventually he attended one of her writing sessions. In it, he asked her questions, or should I say, the alien questions. Technical ones, including electromagnetic formulas, which were way beyond her education level. And she would write down the correct answers, which convinced him she was definitely in contact with something. And then one day Knowles read that Canada is doing a government-funded study of flying saucers, and the head of the program was named Wilbert Smith. Smith publicly expressed interest in electromagnetic propulsion and field theory for UFO explanations. In fact, he was a pretty popular guy. A lot of magazines talked about what Wilbert and Canada were doing. So, Knowles wrote to Smith, and he described Mrs. Swan's messages, gave him samples of automatic writing and what this alien had to say. And that got Wilbert's attention, and he arranged a visit to Maine to see it for himself. So he went to her house, and she entered a trance-like state and began automatic writing. Wilbert would ask Afa technical questions, and he couldn't believe how precise the answers were. Stuff about magnetics and gravitational fields, energy, and even mental science. And that was the beginning of a strange relationship between Mrs. Swan, Wilbert Smith, and Afa. Now, before I go any farther, we need to take a closer look at Mrs. Swan. And in order to take a closer look at Mrs. Swan, and to figure out who she was and what was going on, we first have to take a look into the fall of 1953, because that is when something strange happened. The Cold War was getting hotter, Russia now had nukes too, and everyone was developing long-range missiles, which means you're going to have long-range radars. And when they fired this long-range radar up, they noticed something. The radar operators detected two objects. And these objects were in circular orbits, which, at the time, was a hallmark of artificial satellites. Problem was, no one had put satellites into space yet. Sputnik never got up there until 1957. So, of course, the question is, who put those things up there? And what are they? Now, over time, there hasn't been any official documentation declassified about this, but this case is referenced in other declassified documents, and it was investigated by official government projects like Operation Blue Book. So its existence in the official record really gives this story some weight. And then, in June of 1954, the magazine Aviation Week covered what was going on. It talked about how there was a high level of concern at the Pentagon about what these objects were. One of the theories was that they were satellites. Problem was, nobody had launched any into space yet, that they knew of. But there's really only so many things they could be. Either they were made by us, or something else. And that leads us to Mrs. Swan. Because Mrs. Swan started getting messages from Alpha the alien in 1954. Actually, it was from a group of aliens. Alpha was just her main contact. Now, the weird part of all this was, if it couldn't get any weirder or more strange, these aliens claimed to be orbiting the Earth in two large satellites. Or maybe you call it a spaceship, or a space station. And that these things were something like 190 miles across, which sounds insane. But there was a UFO researcher named Leonard Stringfield, and he reported having testimony from a former Air Force radar officer who had tracked these two mysterious satellites that were orbiting the Earth. And according to him, the radar returns were not from a small-sized object, but these objects were calculated to be like 150 to 190 miles across, which is quite the coincidence. And like I said, Mrs. Swan's main contact was the alien named Alpha, but there was another one that she had contact with too, and his name was Ponar. And she was told that Alpha is the commander of ship M4, and Ponar commanded the ship L11. And as she was getting to know Alpha, Alpha told her that she had actually seen him before. It was Halloween of 1953, and she was at her local town hall decorating it for this Halloween party they were getting ready for. And she saw this very good-looking man come in the hall and was looking at her. He stayed for a little while, and then he left. And when she was getting to know Alpha, he told her that he was that man that walked in the hall, and that he was supposed to walk up to her and shake her hand. But he was afraid he didn't, and he left. Now, that was fall of 1953. And remember, that's when the U.S. Air Force had spotted those objects circling the Earth in the fall of 1953. You know, it's pretty crazy to imagine that that may be a more truer representation of reality than anything else we've ever been told. That there are aliens in spaceships around the Earth who are watching over us and interacting with us. Because remember that this story is told with declassified top secret government documents and personal testimony. It's all the things that you would need in the court of law to prove something is true. And something else that I find interesting is Alpha looked like a human. In fact, every alien ever seen in the 1950s looked like a human. Whether they were normal size, or tall, or short little guys, they all looked like humans. The little gray ones never came around until the early 60s. And the interesting thing is, the gray aliens first came on the scene when Betty and Barney Hill were abducted. And wouldn't you know it, Betty and Barney Hill lived 5 minutes from Mrs. Swan's house, 12 miles down the road. And as far as Mrs. Swan was concerned, those aliens that abducted them, she called the bad aliens. She was not a fan of the little gray guys. Now, I'm not saying the little gray guys are bad. I've talked with some people who've seen them, and I hear good things. But that's another story. Now, Ponar and Alpha had informed Mrs. Swan that they also had a base on the moon, and they were here to warn humanity of the dangers of atomic weapons. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Grant Cameron is what I would consider to be the foremost expert on Wilbert Smith in the world because of his father's connections in the Department of Transport, and he was pursuing this story in the 70s. Many people who knew and worked with Wilbert were still alive. So he was able to get to know Wilbert's son, his wife, and many of his co-workers in his inner circle. And Grant has gone all over North America pursuing leads and documentation on this story. So everything that I'm discussing here is through paperwork, declassified top secret memos, and first-hand eyewitness testimony. Grant has gathered everything that we need to believe that this is true. In fact, to look at all of this evidence that Grant has gathered, and then come to a conclusion that this isn't true, it would not be rational. Now, if you're interested in this, Grant wrote a book called The Canadian Government UFO Story, The Wilbert Smith Files. And the book is basically just documentation that backs up this story. First-hand accounts, declassified top secret memos, and letters from Mrs. Swan to Wilbert Smith. And these letters, to me, they're hilarious. I'll give you a rough example of one. It starts out, Dear Merle and Wib. I guess Wib is short for Wilbur, and Merle is Wilbur's wife. She says, I should have written sooner. We got Donna Lynn, that's her daughter, off to school today. I've been busy sewing for her, but now I shall concentrate on answering your 2 letters. I'm always glad to hear from you. Your letters excite me when I find one in my mailbox, like a small child on Xmas morning. And she goes on to talk about other pleasantries about time flying by and her daughter growing up. And then she says, by the way, did you know that the spacemen and groups are going to run George Van Tassel for president in the United States in 1960? Those people are definitely not of Alpha's organization. All of this seems to frighten me some. Now, George Van Tassel, he's probably one of the most famous UFO alien contactee from the 1950s. So here, she's talking about somehow his group that's behind him wants to run him for president or something, and that these are not the same people or aliens that Alpha's from. And she goes on to talk about other contactees from other, I guess, alien groups. And just saying that Alpha hasn't heard of these guys, and it's pretty wild. And then, at the end of the letter, she ends it with a channeled message from Alpha. And he says, Hello, folks. Do not become disturbed by the words of others. Always remember, I do not work through any forces like the spirits or feelings of compulsion on the part of anyone. If they are sent to you, remember that this is wholly unknown to me. How am I doing? Never fear. Do as you please. All I ask is that you stand by. All is the same as it has been. Now off. Love, Afa. Now these messages that Mrs. Swan would get from Afa were through automatic writing. So when she would write it down, it would look like one long word, and she would have to create the separations so it would make sense. Now Mrs. Swan was the key contact used to communicate between Smith and Afa. But he was open. There were a series of other people who were receiving messages from Afa too. In fact, he was open to anyone who said they had contact with Afa or an alien. And he had a questionnaire that he would give them, that they had to go and ask the alien and fill it out so he could match it up with what Mrs. Swan said and others to make sure it was true. He would even get messages from Afa from a blind guy in Ottawa who would get them through a telex machine. That's an old type of teleprinter. And it would basically receive like text messages through telephone lines. Eventually, Wilbert began to receive messages from Afa himself through the radio, and like I mentioned earlier, having a notepad beside his bed, and he would get messages in his sleep. So it's clear that contact with Afa was a huge part of Wilbert's life. In fact, he had a lot of ideas from Afa, or sometimes he would refer to them as the boys from Topside. And another story is one time the boys from Topside somehow communicated to him an idea for a coil. And this coil was supposed to help them with their radios so they could contact the aliens more easily. It was supposed to create a donut-shaped wave that the aliens could lock into. And he had sent this coil to all the main contactees in the 1950s. George Van Tassel, Daniel Fry, and George Adamski. And he'd explain how to use these things to contact the aliens. And in his files, there are a bunch of letters from these guys writing them back saying, we can't get it to work. And in Grant's research, he did find that eventually Smith said he was able to make contact with them through these coils and somehow using the radio. But his main form of contact seemed to be a notepad beside his bed. The metallurgist that worked with him said that he would show up to work in the morning with his notepad that he had written stuff down on in his sleep. I'm not sure if he would wake up and do it, or if he was in some type of trance, but either way, he would have this pad and be telling his guys what Afa was telling them to do. They had to try this and try that. Now, I know all this sounds pretty crazy, but the more I look into this, the more this is a pattern I see. Take NASA, for instance. NASA was originally started by a guy named Jack Parsons, and he saw no contradiction between science and magic. And he and a couple of his buddies, Aleister Crowley and L. Ron Hubbard, would perform occult rituals in trying to access and attain knowledge, I guess, from the other side. He saw rockets as ritual tools and space travel as a type of occult transformation. So basically, increase in technology means spiritual awakening too. But Jack Parsons died in an explosion in his lab that was supposedly accidental in 1952. And that lab was eventually absorbed into the US government and became NASA. And also the Russian space program. Its beginnings come out of Orthodox Christian mysticism. They believed that humanity's divine duty was to master the cosmos and spread life throughout the universe. That space travel was a type of religious act or redemption. And when you think about the name cosmonaut and astronaut, they both mean star sailor. You know, maybe what happened to Wilbert Smith is just par for the course for people who invent things, especially breakthroughs that have such a huge impact on humanity. So Wilbert was very open about his relationship with AFA among his co-workers, in his lab, and also in the government itself. And with Grant Cameron's investigation, talking with people who worked for him in his inner circle, his wife and his son, and matching this up with government documents, Wilbert's personal journals and letters, he paints quite the picture. And he talks about how Wilbert would attend a local Ottawa flying saucer club. And they would have meetings in the basement of a house. And as they would have their meetings, they would have something floating outside in the air that they referred to as the monitors. They were little glowing donut type things that, from the way they described them, I think they would be talking about what we would call nowadays a type of plasma orb. And the people around there and Wilbert's neighbors were used to seeing them at his house and in his backyard. And there's a story one time of one of them catching one of his trees on fire, which, if you're familiar with the Chris Bledsoe story, something like that happened to him too. And there's a story of one of Wilbert's neighbors saying, "Wilbert, I don't care who your friends are or where they're from, but just keep them off my lawn, because sometimes those orbs would burn the grass underneath of them." Wilbert would also have U.S. government military cars driving up to his house. They would come to the door with a briefcase handcuffed to their arm. They would drop material off, and he would take it to his metallurgist to test it. They would run experiments on it and try and figure out what it was. And they even said that they had material from Roswell. And because of Wilbert's expertise and his need to know for his job, he had even seen a crashed UFO with the alien bodies, and they were like little humans. There was also another story that Wilbert was trying to help the Canadian government contact AFA, and they built a flying saucer landing pad in Suffield, Alberta. That's like Canada's Area 51. And through his communication with AFA, he was trying to line up a date and an agreement with the Canadian government and military that they would not take any shots at the spaceship. And they all privately said yes, but when it came to a cabinet meeting, they couldn't 100% agree, so they scrapped it. And there's one last thing that I want to say about Wilbert's achievements. In my research, I found that in around 1951, Wilbert submitted a paper to the Gravity Research Foundation. And in the episode that I did called Eric Weinstein Can Save the World, I talk about the rich multimillionaire Roger Babson, who had a real interest in anti-gravity type technology and wanted to understand it. So he started the Gravity Research Foundation. And they had an annual contest where you would submit essays on gravity to try and generate an interest in the field, with cash prizes of up to $1,000. And the word in the UFO community around Ottawa and the people of Wilbert's inner circle say that he had entered an essay in that contest. And they have found some correspondence between Roger Babson and Wilbert, which is not surprising considering his expertise. But what I think is interesting is that Eric Weinstein has accused the Gravity Research Foundation as a gatekeeper for gravitational physics. He feels that it has steered away from the promise of anti-gravity research and is stagnated on the pursuit of quantum gravity. And he thinks that in the 50s, they found something. And then they went dark. You know, and there's a part of me that wonders if something that Wilbert submitted was of actual use, and that this could be just another example of government or high-powered, rich scientists for the elites and that damn breakaway civilization stealing his work. Because the reality is, if he really was onto something, they never would have told him anyway. Now, who knows? Maybe someday it will all come out, and Wilbur may be vindicated. Now, down in Maine, Mrs. Swan was quite interactive with the government too. Of course, she was discovered by Admiral Knowles, and through him, she worked with the Navy, the CIA, and was even known to President Eisenhower. And I believe President Eisenhower may have had a few meetings with aliens himself in the 50s. And that is a pattern I find with this whole flying saucer, alien, UFO thing. The deeper I look, the stranger it gets. Now, after having all of this insight into Wilbert Smith's life, how do you think he viewed reality? Having his deep understanding of science and metaphysical contact and channeling communication. How different did he see reality and the world around us than the average person today? Well, he wrote a book in 1958 called The New Science. It wasn't published, it wasn't sold publicly, but there was about 100 copies of this. And it's about what he's discovered with electromagnetism, field theory, and metaphysical principles. Now, I haven't read the book, but I have read about the book. Now just listen to some of the ideas he had in this book. He believed that orthodox physics had reached a dead end because it ignored consciousness, and that everything, matter, energy, life, and consciousness, is an expression of a single fundamental medium, kind of like the ether concept. He also argued that mind is the controlling factor of all that is, and that matter and energy are secondary effects obedient to mind. He felt that maybe advanced beings pilot these UFOs because they have mastered these mind over matter principles. That would explain when people talk about these crafts are somehow controlled telepathically or consciousness-based, that the vehicle is somehow an extension of the pilot's mind. He also talks about how consciousness is the senior partner in the universe, and matter the junior partner, and that thinking is a fundamental process. He describes it not just as a biochemical event, but as an active process of imposing conditions onto the universal field. The power of belief. He understood that an individual's belief could enhance or inhibit their ability to interact with that field, acting as like a governor on their potential. And the unity of all things. Since everything is interconnected through the universal field, the idea of a mind being separate from the object it wishes to influence is an illusion. They are already a part of a continuous whole. So, it's clear, Wilbert felt that he had bridged the gap between matter and consciousness. Now remember, these are things that Wilbert discovered because he was in that need-to-know loop. And he also shared these discoveries with that need-to-know loop until they kicked him out. But I don't think it's right that these governments and corporations do not feel obligated to share with humanity the truth about reality. You know, that reality is classified. Now I'm going to close this with an interview that Wilbert did with a television station in 1961. The reporter was asking him all kinds of questions about what he had learned during his days of investigating flying saucers. Now remember, Smith was kind of a big deal back in the day. He had worked as chief radio engineer for the Canadian government, and he had been in charge of monitoring 50,000 radio frequencies in Canada and ran the top secret Radio Ottawa where spies would radio into intelligence services. He was not some guy tinkering around in his garage with a tinfoil hat on. And one of the questions the reporter asked was, has there been communication between space people and people of this planet? And if contact had occurred, how was it done? And he said, some of the communications have been on face-to-face basis, but I have not been so honored myself. He said that he had had a few communications come through the radio. But listen to this part. He says, by far the majority of the communications are by what we call tensor beam transmission, which uses a type of radio with which we are only vaguely familiar, which I couldn't possibly attempt to describe now. However, the mental images of the person wishing to transmit are picked up, electronically amplified, and modulated into a tensor beam which is directed to the person to whom the transmission is addressed, and within whose brain the mental images are recreated. He said that these transmissions are exact and independent of language, and that he had some experiences with these types of transmissions and can say that they are like nothing within the conventional experiences of Earth people. I guess that's classic boys from Topside for you. The reporter goes on to ask him, what is the official government view of flying saucers? And I like his answer here. He says, I don't even know if there is one in Canada. In the United States, there have been so many contradictory statements made that I doubt if anyone could sort them out. However, I don't think it really matters much anyway, because the saucers are here, and in our opinions regarding them are not going to change matters. It has been my experience that no one who takes even a little time to study the evidence available publicly remains skeptical for very long. The reporter then asked, since you've been studying flying saucers for over 10 years, what have you found out about them? And he answers, there is much evidence that people who build and fly flying saucers are people very much like us. They have been seen on many occasions, and there are many claims of personal contact having been established with them. Communications with these people tell us that they are our distant relatives, that we are descendants of their colonists on this planet, and that they still regard us as brothers even though we don't often act like it. There is much evidence that the technology of these people is quite a bit ahead of ours, and that through studying these saucers and their behaviors, we've been able to piece together some of this technology, and it's amazing to say the least. And then the reporter asked, do you have any indication of why the saucers are here at this time? And Wilbert answers, there is much evidence in history, legend, and the Bible that flying saucers have visited this planet on many occasions in the past, and that the present visitation is nothing new. I think that these people from elsewhere are concerned with our playing with atomic energy and our plans for space travel and interplanetary exploration and conquest. I am sure that they do not hold us in very high esteem and are worried about what we might do if we ever got loose in space, armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. Another question the reporter asked was, do you have any idea where these people are from? And he says, I'm informed that these people are from everywhere, that there is no place in the universe where men can't live that these people don't. And he's then asked, how about traveling in the universe? Does it take a long time? And he says, I am afraid our ideas about certain things are due for a severe revision in the not-too-distant future. I am informed that time is not at all what we think it is, but it is, in fact, variable. And he goes on to say that the speed of light is not a limiting factor. The space people understand that, and they travel around, and it doesn't take them years to do it. Now, did you hear that? He's saying that we don't understand what time is, and when we find out, we'll be in for quite the shock. You know, that's something I keep bumping into over and over and over again. That we don't quite understand what time is. Maybe he's discovered what Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and even Eric Weinstein think. Time is not what we think it is. It's not necessarily linear. Maybe he is aware of Philip K. Dick's orthogonal time. Who knows? And then the reporter says, I know this may be a hot question, but how do you think flying saucers affect religion? Now, listen to his answer. As far as I can determine, these people from elsewhere are a great deal more religious than we are. They believe in a supreme creator, the brotherhood and divinity of man, and a plan for the evolution of all. To these people, their religion is a matter of daily reality, not just the Sunday profession. And they certainly seem to practice what we preach. And I can't find any contradictions with any of the religions of this planet. Well, there you have it. His description of the boys from Topside, the space people, the aliens, is not scary at all. Well, at least not scary to humanity, because what Wilbert's discovered is these aliens aren't here to invade the Earth. They're here to liberate it.